Okay, yeah, we'll go back to the trade-offs and sort of the how you build a flower and what are all the pressures that the plant, kind of has to consider, I guess, when it's building a flower in terms of their environment, their predators, whatever else.
Yeah, so we recognize what a lot of the adaptations of flower parts might be in terms of their attractiveness, their protection, their promotion of wind pollination versus insect pollination. So there are a lot of things like that that seem like obvious adaptations, but a lot of those things are very expensive to produce. So it takes a lot of energy to produce a lot of nectar to attract a certain type of pollinator. It takes a lot of energy to produce the pollen for a pollen collecting pollinator. And even for wind pollinated species, like a lot of grasses, they produce tons and tons of pollen because that pollen is just going out into the environment with no specified place for it to land. And so it's like totally chance that it's going to land on female parts of another flower. So there are huge investments that flowering plants make in order to assure that there is reproduction through these methods, but it must be beneficial or none of this would be taking place. So what it might be the benefits? Well, one benefit is certainly the benefit of sexual reproduction, which can contribute to enhanced opportunities for adaptation to different environments. So for a widespread species, it might be beneficial to be able to generate different combinations that would be adaptive in different environments. Also in environments that change a lot, either spatially or temporally, having these different combinations could be really beneficial. And for the most part, we don't necessarily know what the conditions are that led originally to the origins of particular floral structures. But we can hypothesize after the fact, oh, maybe this was an advantage for that. A lot of times we can't actually do the test. And so the testing comes through different types of mathematical modeling and through simulation. So you could say, okay, what happens if you invest this amount of resources in a flower, but you only get this much benefit? What's going to happen on the long term or something like that? So you can investigate some of these sorts of things from a theoretical standpoint, because we can't go. Unfortunately, we don't really have the right time machines to go back and see what things were like at the point of origin.
Mhm. I guess just the colors is an interesting feature to key in on. Why are there so many different colors?
Yeah, the colors that plants produce are amazing. And then, I think it's always kind of fun, but also important to think about what the colors are as we see them versus
Mhm.
the colors that potential pollinators see them as. A lot of animals, don't see colors, or they only see certain colors, or they see colors in a certain range. They don't necessarily see what we're seeing. So for a lot of plants that are, we might look at them and we see blue. It's the underlying pigments that matter to the pollinators are not the blue pigments that we see, but instead they might be the yellow pigments that underlie the blues that are there. Some people working on certain types of pollination biology will actually photograph flowers under ultraviolet light or under different types of light in order to get a better handle on the what different potential pollinators might be seeing. And a lot of times even we might look at a flower and we might see on the petal that it's just yellow, but a pollinator might actually see these little stripes that are there because there are stripes in the other compounds, things that we don't see, but that are obvious to the pollinators. And they're like little landing strips that sort of guide the pollinators in toward the center of the flower. So there's a lot, I keep saying this, I guess there's a lot we don't know about flower pigments. I mean, we do know that there are a couple of broad classes of pigments that flowering plants produce. So the main category that plants use for things like reds and blue pigments, those are called anthocyanins. And they're a very widespread category of compound. They're related to some of the secondary defense compounds that a lot of plants make. And there are small deviations in those flowers, or in those chemicals will yield blue versus pink versus, red or purple sorts of flowers. There's another broad category called betalins, and those are all restricted to one particular group of plants, but they're also highly diverse. But they produce the same colors as the anthocyanins, reds, blues, pinks, and purples. And things like the cacti have produced that particular class of compounds. And then there are compounds that are in the yellow, that are various shades of yellow, that are often produced as, what we could kind of think of them as background color, because they're produced even when there are these pinks and blues and reds that are produced. But we don't see them unless there's a mutation and the red colors doesn't get produced. So there's a lot of chemistry that goes into also into building flowers in terms of their color. Certain pollinators that are then, of course, attracted to different colors. So we think of hummingbirds as being attracted to generally red, not always, but generally red tubular flowers. A lot of bees will visit blue or white or sometimes even yellow flowers. And then hawk moths will visit typically white flowers and white flowers that are open at night. And the hawk moths will visit for nectar. There are a lot of these syndromes that don't hold up 100%, but that are general categories of pollination. So certain flower colors and shapes might attract a certain pollinator. And that's always a good hypothesis then for what the pollinators might be, because in most cases, we don't actually know what the real pollinators are.
Okay. That feeds well into my next question. I was wondering why flowers would select for specific pollinators. To my thoughts, it would just be the more the merrier, the more things you can get in here. The famous case is the Darwin flower, right? The flower that's he hypothesized there must be this animal because it needs to be pollinated by something with a very specific tool to get into the flower. And it
Right.
just seemed weird to me that a flower would adapt these features to exclude everything but like one pollinator. So
Yeah, no, really. So, I mean, I guess some of this is sort of just reflects that natural selection doesn't always follow what we think might be the best strategy, right? So, I would say there are generally multiple ways to solve a problem. So the problem is assurance of pollination and reproduction. There can be selection on a number of different ways of going about that. So one strategy that some plants have is to be generalists, and they actually don't care who their pollinators are as long as it's something. They'll produce a flower that's very open, that has moderate amount of pollen and nectar and stuff, and you might then get a bunch of different things, like a bunch of different types of maybe bees, maybe some flies and things. And so through having this generalist strategy, you tend to maximize your pollination likelihood. But then there are other species, as you mentioned, that have this one-on-one relationship with a pollinator, and that might work super well under certain conditions, because that pollinator is only going to visit that plant, and that means that okay, that there will be visits, but if something happens to that pollinator, then there could be some serious repercussions for the plant, and vice versa. And actually, it's interesting because this is something that we're seeing right now with climate change, is that plants and their pollinators are not always responding in the same way to changing temperatures. So some plants are flowering earlier and flowering longer than they did previously. We have lots and lots of data to support that. And some pollinators are emerging at different times because of changes in temperature in particular. And so what's happening is that plants and their pollinators are not always in sync with each other anymore. And so there are a lot of pollinators that don't have the plants that they're adapted to feeding on as food sources. And there are a lot of plants that don't have the pollinators that they're adapted for for actually doing the pollination. And so there's a lot of concern, I would say probably more among insect biologists about this pollinator mismatch that seems to be arising. Maybe more concern from that side than from the plant side, because often a lot of plants will have a backup system, which is self-fertilization. If the pollination between plants doesn't work, a lot of them have a backup.